of course, all of these technologies require some form of connectivity to be powerful. It's easy in major metropolitan centres like Brisbane to think that connectivity is a relatively straightforward thing. You open your device, you turn it on, it has little bars, all is good. There are other places in the world where connectivity happens in some ways despite the technology, not because of it. This is one of my researchers in India recently. We had been tracking the development of mobile phones there. As many of you know, that's a place that went from having about 10 million mobile phones a decade ago to 850 million now. It's the fastest mobile phone ramp in history. Many technology companies, however, and analysts tend to disregard India because what they'll tell you is, well, that is a lot of phones, most of them aren't quote-unquote smartphones. I don't know what that does make them. Dumb phones doesn't seem to be quite as good a name. I guess feature phones is what we call them. So 850 million phones, most of them feature phones, so not a particularly interesting market. Turns out, however, if you are in India, as I'm sure some of us have been, and you ask people what's on their phones, you discover that their phones are somewhat at odds with the absence of a network. So many of these are phones that are full of content. And we actually started to ask people, well, how do you get content on your phone? Because we know there's no network to move the content. What's it about? They all said, Media Man. It was a great title, so we're like, okay, take us to a media man. This is one. He runs a small shop in a train station. You take your phone to him, and you say, I want media. He says, okay. And he takes your phone, and if it's a Friday afternoon, he fills your phone with weekend media content. Lots of Bollywood, lots of music, it's all good. You come back on Monday, and he fills your phone with work week content. News, more Bollywood, more music, sport. You come back on Friday, same thing happens. He charges a nominal fee for this. He basically does all the work here. He deletes the content, he adds new content. He's, of course, aggregating all the content in his shop. Now, if you were looking for content, you wouldn't find a network in the way we traditionally recognize it, but you would find a network of people. And so as we think about how content is going to move, of course it moves across networks, but not all of those networks are technical. Some of those networks are social. Some of them are deeply entrepreneurial. Of course, in many cases, they're probably breaking some of the rules about copyright protection. Nonetheless, I think there's an argument here that says content wants to be free and will find a way to do so, not free in the sense of not financially bound, but in the sense of it wants out, it wants to be feral and run around. So when we think about what it means to talk about connectivity, for me as a researcher, I think it's always really important to imagine that there are multiple ways that content will circulate. And it's not as straightforward as is there a technical network. It's going to be about other things and about other sorts of relationships. It also means that entrepreneurs like this know a tremendous amount about what media is trending, because they're, of course, the aggregation point. And thinking about how you collect information about what media is powerful and potent in the moment may mean tapping into different sources than we've historically imagined. It's also the case as we move forward that I think for many consumers, being constantly connected to anything is actually burdensome. When I was in Korea many years ago, I encountered this sign in a Korean church, and it reads loosely, translated into English, "It would be a blessing if you turned off your cell phone." There's a sign next to it that says, "Turn off your phone and listen to the call of God." And then there was a third sign that says, "We have a cell site dampener," which basically means the rest of it was just polite rhetoric. But this notion of there being places where people can't get connected, I suspect is powerful. I was really struck, I don't know if any of you saw this in the Qantas magazine this month, but by the notion of black hole resorts. And that didn't mean resorts in space, that actually meant resorts where nothing worked, no technology, as now part of the selling point of why you'd like to go somewhere. And I think, while we've historically had train carriages that were mobile free, and we've talked about what it meant to have zones of non-mobile technology, we're also starting to see this in people's homes. Consumers arguing about whether you can bring the iPad to bed, the smartphone to bed, what technologies go in what parts of the house, what is on and what isn't. I think the only good news here for any of us is that radio seems to be absolutely exempt from these rules and finds its way worming into many parts of people's lives. But just because we have 24-hour technology doesn't mean that people want to be engaging with it. And I think there's, as a researcher, a really interesting tension here between the demands of the technology and of the services, which frankly work better when they're engaged 24 hours a day, connected to a network and connected to content, and consumers and citizens who work better when they're intermittently disconnected. After all, we have major world systems where consumers have been disconnected for a day or a month or a year. Think about all the various rituals we have about time. And this notion of needing to be disconnected is important.